Thank you, Olga. Good morning, everyone. I'm Reverend Lynda Sutherland, minister at First Parish Unitarian Universalist of Northborough. Welcome to the third in our series of 4 shared worship services with the Unitarian Church of Marlborough and Hudson and First Parish together. As we gather together as 2 congregations, we invite you into the mode of experimentation and curiosity as we experience one another's rituals and alternate between ways of doing things. Unfortunately, Reverend Alice has the stomach bug this morning and is not able to join me in leading worship. She sends heartfelt apologies. Fortunately, the UCMH board president, Johanna Ambrosio LaPlante, will join me in the dialogue sermon. And so right now, I'm inviting you to stay in gallery view for a few moments as we do our special online greeting that we have come to call the Brady Bunch greeting. Here's how it goes. We wave into the camera, say hi to everybody, wave to the people above you, below you, and on either side. It's so good to be together. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. I'm Cynthia Menard, the Director of Lifelong Learning for UCMH. To keep communication clear in our online format, we've developed some nonverbal signals that we can use together. We can send each other love or support with a hug. We can give applause and say hallelujah, huzzah, fantastic, with 2 hands waving. If you have a need to be called on for any reason, joys and sorrows or announcements, 1 hand up works well. Or you can also use your Zoom participant raise hand option if you're able to find it. We have the hand knock, which is my favorite, to say, I connect, I agree, 100%. And finally, for security, we do ask, as always, that you use your real name on your screen if it isn't already there, so that we know who is gathered with us.
And now we'll light our chalice. Today, we're only broadcasting our chalice from First Parish since we have Alice out of commission. Welcome to a new story. Welcome to a day unwritten. We gather to speak of possibility. We remember the losses. We celebrate the victories. As a people of story, we embrace the possible over the probable, weaving a story of hope. Join us in the new story. Join us in the day unwritten. Join us in the future of possibility.
I invite you to join me in the unison reading, which we recite every Sunday at UCMH. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another, to the end that all souls shall grow in harmony with the divine.
So I invite you now to take a deep breath. Feel yourself grounded on this good earth and let yourself be drawn into worship this morning. We gather as a house of stories. As we learn of those who have gone before, the way in front of us becomes more clear.
In the world of the driven, let us be drawn in. Let your love be a given, let us be drawn in. To imagine, to dream, to create, to redeem. For the sake of the living, let us be drawn in. As we weave together the tales of who we are, our loneliness lessens, and the web of our oneness is revealed.
As we listen deeply in those times of tender trust, we descend into the longings and learnings, hopes and fears of the humanity we share.
Beneath the wells from which we drink, there is a deeper well that feeds them all.
Come, let us tell each other tales of our thirst. Let us drink from the stories that sustain us all. In the world of the driven, let us be drawn in. Let your love be a given, let us be drawn in. To imagine, to dream, to create, to redeem. For the sake of the living, let us be drawn in.
Let us drink from the stories that sustain us all. Come, let us be drawn in as we mingle our stories together.
So beautiful. Our story for all ages today is called The Broken Story by the Reverend Christina Leon Tracy. This is a story about a man with a story about stories, if you will. Once upon a time, there was a man with a story. This wasn't any old once upon a time story, not one you could find on a bookshelf or hear around the campfire. This was his story and no one else's. This story had been carefully crafted. It began before he was born, and this story told of his loves and fears, his dreams realized, and his dreams yet to come. This story was complete. It told his whole life, including those bits that still existed in his imagination. In fact, this story was so complete, and he was so happy with his story that he carried it around to make sure it was safe. It was somewhat bulky and unwieldy, but he didn't mind. It was his story. The thing about this story was it was very fragile, made up of many pieces and held together by only his own imagination. He was worried it might break apart at any minute, and so he grew more and more protective of his story. He even held it close, and as he went about his life, he checked on the story to make sure he was following it correctly. He avoided adventure and unknowns because, well, they might break his story. And then one day, the inevitable happened. Without warning, his story broke. It was unforeseen, and he hadn't done anything wrong at all. But there it was, laying in 1,000 shattered pieces on the ground, with the sunlight glinting off the bits of story he had so carefully protected for all those years. He was heartbroken. And since his story hadn't said to put the pieces back together, he was at a loss. What now? He sat down next to the pile of pieces and cried. A while later, maybe minutes, maybe hours, a group of people came out of a nearby building and saw him sitting on the sidewalk, surrounded by a pile of broken pieces, clearly in need of help. What happened here? A woman asked. My story, it's gone. I worked so hard to build it, to protect it, to keep it from harm, and now it's gone, gone, he wailed. Is this the story here? A man asked. Yes, look at it. There's nothing left of it. It looks like it's here and not gone, said a child. We just have to put it back together. Put it together? There's no way. You don't even know what it looked like. How will you put it together if you don't even know me? The child was tenacious. Don't worry. With all of us here to help, we'll put it back together in a way that you would never expect. You never know. It might even be more beautiful than before. And so they swept up the pieces of this man's story carefully and went together into the building from which they had emerged. They poured him some hot coffee and sang a song he had never heard before, something about coming again and again, though you've broken your vows 1,000 times. The song was soothing and the coffee was warm. He began to feel hope again that his story could be put back together. And it took a long time. Maybe it was days, maybe it was years, but they got it all back together. And they added new parts, and some old parts didn't fit anymore, but that was okay. The child had been right. It was more beautiful than before. And this time, the story was held together not only by his imagination, but the imagination and support of an entire community. It wasn't nearly so fragile, and it even allowed for adventure.
That's a great story, Cynthia. I wonder, have you ever had a story that became so broken that you didn't see how you could put it back together again all by yourself? I wonder who has helped you to make a new story out of the broken pieces. I wonder what new adventures might await as we pick up the pieces of broken stories and fashion them into new tales of life and living. Please join in our opening song, Come, Come, Whoever You Are.
Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving. Ours is no caravan of despair. Come, yet again come. Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving. Ours is no caravan of despair. Come, yet again come. leaving. Ours is no caravan of despair. Come yet again, lover of leaving. Ours is the caravan wherever you are. Wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving. Ours is no caravan of despair. Come yet again, lover of leaving. Ours is the caravan wherever you are. Wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving. Ours is no caravan of despair. Come yet again, lover of leaving. Ours is the yet again of despair. Come yet again, come.
And thankful for the blessing of being together in community, we hold all these joys, sorrows, and concerns in our hearts as we sing together, Draw the Circle Wide. Now I offer up a prayer of risk in the words of Tamara Lebeck. Holy One, who has given us the breath of life, today we remember to breathe deeply, to rest, to take in, to pause before we act, and then to take in another deep breath, poised on the edge, and risk jumping in, risk taking action, risk speaking up, risk using the gifts we have been given so that at the end of our life, we can say with absolute clarity that no part of our existence was wasted in fear of failure or fear of success. Hold us. Prepare us the way to begin to offer the gift of our awakened presence, full of love and light today. These and the prayers of our hearts we lift up now in the silence. Amen. Blessed be, and may it be so. And now I have a reading by Sean Neil Barron called A History of Church, including yours. One day your church was born. Maybe it was a gathering of saints called together for the common worship of a wrathful God, ceaselessly praying between bouts of decrying the evil of Christmas or dancing. Or maybe a few brave souls answered a notice in the newspaper, curiosity piqued by the announcement of a religion where free thinking and tolerance were bedrocks. No matter how it happened, your church was born. A gathering of people, humble, caring, anxious, and quirky, all at the same time, who covenanted to be with one another on the journey of life, death, and everything in between. And so it began, a faithful few, beautifully imperfect, called to that central task, that human task of connecting, loving, and serving. It was just a baby, and yet it was thrust deep into the human condition, tasked to hold minds and souls, bodies and hearts along the roller derby of disease and birth, infighting and joy, and Christmas pageants. Sometimes all of those at the same time. They gathered to hear the world broken open, for insightful sermons, rejuvenating music, and a community whose fierce devotion to each other's well-being rivaled a mama bear's for her cubs. But it wasn't always like that, of course. There were the trying times, and I don't mean just those stubborn but lovable souls who inhabit the netherworld of committee meetings. No, I mean the trying things. The time when the church almost split in half over the war or integration, or when the mill left the town vacant, or when the minister crossed that line and the people couldn't speak about it for decades. But somehow you were still here, still on the town common, still the church that everyone recognizes, still the ones that show up every time you were called for. Still using the communion silver until you voted to sell it or put it in the museum. New people came and they changed things, small things, big things, things that nobody noticed as it happened until suddenly it was hard to even recognize anything anymore. That was a hard moment, a tearful moment. And other things changed too. The proclamations about God, once heard loud from the pulpit, softened. Wrathful became loving. Distant became intimate. Mandatory became optional. After the war, the nursery and RE classrooms were overflowing. Each baby dedicated reminded the church of the incredible beauty of life and the gift this community, all huddled around baby, would bestow upon this child. The history of your church is more a story of the determination of love to break forth than it is about tie-dye or chalices, sermon discussions, or social justice committee meetings. The history of the church is the history of human enterprise, evolving in its sights and sounds, yet revolving always around its core. The history of your church is the gift of potential and momentum, of baggage and personality. The history of your church is the launch pad from which you spring into action or disarray. Each day, your church is born.
For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, our grandmother's prayers, and we are
This morning, Reverend Lynda and I are doing a joint sermon dialogue. It's a little different than the usual structure of a sermon, but it's a great way to share our stories of our different congregations, some sad, some funny. So I'd like to begin by asking Reverend Lynda if you can tell us a little bit about the beginnings of the first parish.
Well, our congregation was founded in 1746. So this is our 275th anniversary year. Wow. Folks had settled in Northborough area and felt it would be nice to have a church closer than the one in Westborough. And they also wanted to incorporate as a township. And in those days, every town first had to have a church. And their minister would serve to provide moral guidance to the townspeople. In New England, if a church is called First Parish, it was usually one of these anchor churches. The folks of Northborough's First Parish drew up a covenant for its members to abide by, which included these words, and I just love this: walk toward each other in love. You know, town meetings were held in the church buildings in those days. And so the church building was often referred to as the meeting house. And Northborough's first preacher, Reverend Peter Whitney, was known to have preached fiery sermons against King George, the tyrant. Another interesting thing is that within a short time of the congregation's beginnings, a terribly contagious illness hit the area. This coughing sickness claimed many lives, including over 30 children. A cemetery was dedicated behind the church to lay them to rest, and it's now the Northborough Town Cemetery. And several of First Parish's early ministers are buried there.
A lot of what you shared, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Finish. I'm so sorry.
No, I was.
Okay. Thank you. A lot of what you've shared is similar for us as well. And actually, UCMH is the story of 4 different foundings in Marlborough, in Hudson, and then the merged congregation. The parent church in Marlborough was, like your congregation, also the original church in the town. It was founded in 1666 and recently celebrated its 350th anniversary. In the early 1800s, the congregation needed a new building, and there was a conflict about where that building would be. After a highly contested vote, some members in the congregation took the minister with them and split off to become the second parish of Marlborough in 1805. That's the church that ultimately became Unitarian. Meanwhile, before Hudson was actually Hudson, it was called Feltonville back then, a group of abolitionists wanted a church where there would be freedom of thought. They gathered in a few different places in town, including the building that is currently the very popular Micro Creamery, and a couple of pubs I think were used along the way. Ultimately, they built the church that we now use. The church building went up in 1847. The first minister was an abolitionist named George Stacy. He had actually given up preaching after he was kicked out of his pulpit in West Boylston because of his views on slavery. He agreed to preach in Hudson and traveled 2 hours each way by horse and buggy.
Wow.
Yeah, for 14 years. First once a month and then twice a month. He was actually never called or paid. He was just reimbursed for the expenses of his horse. And then finally, the fourth beginning was when the 2 churches in Marlborough and Hudson merged in 1972 to become one church.
Wow, that's so interesting. I'm sure your congregation has experienced many times of challenge and struggle. How did your folks respond?
Well, it's interesting. Financial issues have been issues at different times over the years, and this has been true for the Hudson congregation from the very beginning. George Stacy, the first minister, wrote a letter to the congregation early on saying, "The season for this undertaking was unpropitious, And I confess that my hope was small in your immediate success. I guess that was, the way of the time back then for saying, I didn't think you guys were going to make it. In 1879, over only 18 years after the new church had been built, the minister at the time resigned because the church couldn't maintain his salary. He apparently hadn't been told about how much debt we were in when he first was called and was not happy about that. He wrote, "Our indebtedness is too heavy a burden for us to carry and will certainly sink us." That same year, the church took a vote on whether to sell the church and the parsonage, and also on whether they should stop holding services altogether. Instead, the church reorganized itself. They changed their voting and membership policies. They brought new members onto the board, and within 7 years had turned everything around. The mortgage was paid, and there was a balance of $100 in the church bank book. Many years later, the Marlborough and Hudson congregations again faced a critical decision. Each congregation was struggling financially and seeing a decline in their membership numbers. The minister in Marlborough was having health issues and resigned from his position to become a computer programmer. The congregation voted unanimously to share the Hudson minister. For a time, the two congregations traveled back and forth between the two buildings until they finally merged and sold the building in Marlborough. So, how about for your congregation, Lynda? Do you have stories of times that you have faced a challenge?
Oh, of course. Over the years, First Parish has faced many times of challenge. And each time, the congregation has met the moment with resilience and determination. One such crisis was the time the church building burned down. Sometime in the 1950s, I believe. I don't have the facts and figures in front of me, and my memory for those kinds of things are not great. So forgive me if I get some dates wrong. But it was back in the 1950s sometime, I think. Anyway, it was a total loss, and the congregation worked together to move a World War II Army chapel onto the property to serve as the meeting place, while they cleared away the wreckage of the old church building, held countless dinners and fairs and auctions to raise money, and rebuilt their building, much of it put up with their own hands. One of the more challenging times in our congregation happened about 40 years ago when a well-beloved minister, Mac Mitchell, was indicted, tried, and sentenced for child molestation. In addition to the hurt and confusion this caused, it left the congregation suddenly without a minister. Again, folks came together and held lay-led services for some 18 months while they processed their feelings, examined their priorities, and finally were able to call an interim minister. These challenges helped to build a deep sense of resilience within the congregation, which has been really valuable as we've faced the challenges that COVID has brought to us.
Wow, those are quite some stories, and there's a lot of parallels in our stories. I wanted to tell the story of how we became a welcoming congregation. A little more than 20 years ago, we had a major conflict in our church about whether or not to continue our charter with a local Boy Scout troop that had been meeting in our building since its inception. And we're talking about 100 years of relationship. But the issue was that the national policies at the time that were discriminatory against gay scout leaders and troop members. And we had a series of meetings to talk about these issues. And it was, we invited the Boy Scout troop leaders to come in, but it was very divisive. And we ultimately lost members on both sides of that equation. Ultimately, the congregation voted to keep the charter with the Boy Scouts, but to have the troop sign a document stating that they would not discriminate in their local troop. Some of our members still felt that wasn't enough, and they resigned. But ultimately, the congregation voted to start the Welcoming Congregation curriculum and to build toward becoming an intentionally welcoming community for LGBTQIA folks. Some were not happy with this decision about becoming a welcoming congregation or starting the journey on that and resigned. in the end, a few years later, it was an incredible moment of joy when the congregation did, in fact, vote unanimously to become a welcoming congregation.
Wow, that's really impressive. You're right. We do have a lot of stories that are similar. Actually, right after the story I just told, the interim minister helped the congregation prepare for a search, and the candidate that the search team liked best was a lesbian. And some folks in the congregation were really afraid that would make their church a gay haven or the lesbian church. The debate went round and round, and as the story goes, one woman stood up and told the gathered members that she had a lesbian daughter who would benefit from a role model. And that changed the conversation because now they're talking about one of their own. Reverend Rochelle was called and served for over a decade.
That's great. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we have a couple of funny stories from our archives. You know, we have a list with information about some various ministers who have served our congregation, and it mentions a minister from Marlborough who actually built the church organ, a beautiful, glorious pipe organ that Robin is very familiar with. But it has the note on these archives: sadly, he lost his sanity while trying to keep the organ tuned. You gotta wonder what exactly happened there. I really don't know. Obviously, it was before our time. But there are also a couple of stories that show what we love about our congregation in terms of our justice work over the years. One of our founders was named Charles Brigham. He was probably the key mover and shaker, and of course Brigham's a well-known name in Hudson. We don't have documentation about whether the church building itself was used as part of the Underground Railroad. There's some stories about maybe that it was, but we don't have proof. But, you know, nobody wrote this stuff down, you know, because it was illegal to shelter escaping folks. But we do know that Brigham himself was involved in the Underground Railroad. He actually drove around town in a hearse. Although he wasn't an undertaker, he was a farmer. So he would bring formerly enslaved people to his farm in Hudson and, you know, send them on their way to Canada from there. But he drove a hearse, we think, because he was transporting escaping slaves. And, you know, back then, of course, nobody was going to open a coffin to search for anybody. And, you know, there's a couple of other stories about one was about women's suffrage. And if you've been to our building, maybe you've seen the glorious rose window in the very back of the church. And actually, it's the back as you're facing, but it's the front of the church from the outside. But that window was donated in honor of F. Ellen Brown. She was one of the early women movers and shakers in our congregation. And she was a woman who just took no guff. So before women actually had gotten the right to vote officially, she and a group of other women, I think they were all members of our church, showed up at the polling place in Hudson. Town hall is right across the street. And, you know, these 5 women marched in, 5 or 6, and the clerk said, you're not on our rolls. And, you know, I can't really let you vote. And she said, well, clearly there was a clerical error. And he, being, I guess, a smart guy, said, oh, go ahead. So these 5 women actually voted before it was allowed. We don't know if it was planned in advance or just because of her formidable strength of presence, but that was the kind of woman she was.
Oh, those stories are so delightful. I could sit and tell stories with you all day. I promise we won't. But I do have a couple funny stories from our congregation. Many years ago, the minister at the time was just beginning his sermon when a messenger hurried in with a little folded piece of paper and handed it to him. And he unfolded it and read it and put it aside and continued with his hour-long sermon. The note said, "Your house is on fire." His house was a total loss. I think I might not have continued with my sermon. My second story also involves fire. When the Pulse nightclub shooting happened, there was a lovely memorial ritual held where one candle was lit for each of the victims, and they placed them in a big saucer filled with sand, one candle for each victim. The congregation noticed sometime later that the candles had melted down to the point where the pool of wax on the sand caught fire. And at first it looked so pretty, but then the flames started shooting higher and higher. They managed to put it out before it did any damage, luckily.
Very good.
And my third story is just from a couple years ago. I was preaching a sermon on story, actually. And to set the mood, our altar design folks had arranged logs and twinkle lights to look like a campfire on the altar. So I talked. I was giving a wonderful sermon, and all of a sudden people started pointing. I turned around, and there on the altar in front of the campfire was a mouse. And, I really don't know how I kept from shrieking, but all of a sudden I must have really been in minister mode, because the light in me saw the light in the mouse. And I went on with my sermon, and meanwhile the mouse went on his way and managed to climb the leg of one of the women in the pews. And how she kept from shrieking, I'll never know.
Oh my
So
God.
Joanna, how would you describe your congregation today? Size, theological bent, strengths and challenges?
Well, we're about 55 members, with another 20 or so folks who are regular participants in programming. And theologically speaking, we're a classic, eclectic, and diverse UU congregation. We have strong pagan group, a growing group of folks with Buddhist leanings. About a third of our congregation are atheist or agnostic, and about a third are theistic, some with Jewish or Christian background. And for strengths, we have a wonderful, welcoming congregation that really has a gift for loving people as they are. Folks show up for one another in really beautiful and powerful ways. It's also a very flexible congregation. We experiment a lot together with new ways of doing worship or other things, and we're really open to new ways of doing things. Despite our small size, we have tremendous faith formation programming. Pre-COVID, we were offering dozens of programs every semester with more than 1,000 people in attendance over the course of a year. During COVID, we've moved lots of programs online, of course, but attendance has mostly been our own members. And as for challenges, we have the ongoing financial struggles faced by many small congregations. How about you?
That sounds a lot like our congregation. We're about 100 members. We also have a number of people who don't come to worship, but who attend our programs. We have theologically the symbols above our altar are all the different symbols. I don't know if you've noticed them, but they're all the different symbols of different faith traditions. And the most recent one to be added is the earth-based tree symbol, tree of life. And it represents, so our congregation is theologically diverse, and we have quite a group of pagans and including indigenous traditions. We have quite a few people who come from a Jewish tradition, and we have traditionally celebrated Days of Awe every year, and often a Seder. We have theists as well as you do, and we have a large number of people who draw inspiration from Buddhism. In fact, the previous settled minister, Judith, was a Buddhist.
Huh.
We also face the typical kinds of challenges that most congregations face, smaller numbers, aging elders, keeping 2 aging buildings in repair, learning to communicate with the congregation and each other, and the constant human challenge of learning and growing together as we follow our different spiritual paths. Our strengths, we have a reputation, like you, for being welcoming and warm. We are a green congregation. In fact, our solar panels were just installed last week. Folks are active in civic affairs. We have a couple of people who have run and even won office recently. We love to laugh. We're generous. We are committed to being a fair share congregation with our UUA pledges, a fair compensation for our staff, and we have been sharing our half plate for quite a few years. And like you, flexible and willing to try new strings, willing to try new things.
Yeah, we certainly have a lot in common, which actually leads me to the next point, which is sort of the elephant in the room for, at least for UCMH. We've had some very early discussions about potential merger between our 2 congregations, and we're still both individually discerning whether we want to consider a merger at all, or with each other in particular. But whatever the outcome is, I love knowing that we've gotten to know you folks better, and we'll continue to do that this month, the rest of this month, and hopefully we'll have parties together at some point in the near future, and post COVID, and just sort of see each other in person at some point soon. I know the choir's working on that. The 2 choirs are working on that. So I think these are just collaborations that will continue to enrich each congregation and both of us together. And Reverend Alice has told me that she really has loved working with you and your worship team this month, and learning how we've adapted for COVID, each of us, and hearing your stories.
Well, the feeling is mutual. It's been so much fun working with Alice and your worship team. This is an amazing journey, figuring out how to draw upon the strengths of each worship team and combining or alternating rituals, trying out new techniques and sharing stories and laughs, solving the technical difficulties, or gremlins, as Dennis calls them. We are each congregation is writing the story of our lives, and we all help write that story. It's nice to have companions on the journey as we move into an unknown future that's full of possibility. And we are looking forward to discovering ways to help and support each other in the coming months. Let's continue walking toward each other in love and mutual support. Thank you so much, Johanna.
Thanks, Reverend Lynda. You're very welcome.
Now it's time to collect the offering. Half of our offering today will go to Together on Turtle Island, a group that started up last March in response to COVID to bring relief to Native peoples. Utilizing both short and long-term programs, Together on Turtle Island seeks to foster and support sovereignty in the areas of water, food, PPE, and other necessities of daily life. Please give as generously as you are able to support this life-sustaining cause using the instructions provided in the chat. And now you're invited to join with Olga in singing Building a New Way.
We are building a new way. We are building a new way. We are building a new way, feeling stronger every day. We are building every day. We are working to be free. Working to be free. We are working to be free. Hate and greed and jealousy. We are working to be free. We can feed our every need. We can feed our every need. We can feed our every need. Start with love, that is the seed. We can feed our every need. Peace and freedom is our cry. Peace and freedom is our cry. Peace and freedom is our cry. Without this world will die. Peace and freedom is our cry.
Thank you, Olga. I love that flourish at the end. We have gathered in love, worshiped in hope, and lifted our hearts in peace. We extinguish our chalice and go now to share these blessings with the world. And I leave you with this blessing. May we have the courage to speak or write the stories within us that need to be told, the stories that make up our lives. May we listen with a loving mind and heart to the stories of others' lives, others here in this church and others in our wider community and world. Let us choose with care the stories that we teach to our children, remembering that all our stories have power and that all of our stories are connected, for all life is one. In the name of all that is sacred in these gathered hearts, may it be so. Amen. Blessed be, and aho.